For this week, our topic will be the female reproductive system. Now, the functions of the female reproductive system are a bit more complicated than the male reproductive system for a few reasons. First off, the female reproductive system doesn't just have to deal with the processes of gametogenesis and sex and fertilization. It also has to deal with the entire process of gestation, of generating a new human being. In addition, female humans, at least, have a cyclical fertility period. Men are basically always fertile. Women are fertile only certain times. That cyclical fertility period requires some pretty complex regulation. So, what are the functions of the female reproductive system? First off, the production of gametes, in this case, ova or eggs. This process is called oogenesis. This double O is typically pronounced O-O. Second, transportation of the ova to the site of fertilization. Ova are made in the ovaries, but fertilization can happen anywhere along the path from the ovaries to the uterus, but the uterus is where it's going to have to end up if it's going to be a successful pregnancy. Third, incubation of the fertilized egg. Basically, when the egg is fertilized and in its embryo stage, this is the stage before it begins to develop complex organ and tissue structures, the fertilized egg is pretty much directly supported by the female reproductive system and the uterus. During the later stages of development, the egg has developed into a fetus, and the fetus is surrounded by a placenta. At this point, it's the placenta's job to nurture the developing embryo and fetus. However, the female reproductive system has to provide support for that placenta and provide nutrients and really everything else that the growing fetus will need. Fifth, we got to get that baby out of there at some point. So the process of birth is part of the female reproductive system. Sixth, control and development of sexual characteristics in females. These are secondary sexual characteristics, the growth of mammary glands, all of the changes that happen in puberty, things like that. And also, last, the hormonal regulation of the timing of ovulation and menstruation. All right? So let's start with an overview of the female reproductive anatomy. All of these things are important, but I'm going to highlight a few of them that will be relevant in this lecture. The primary female reproductive organ is the ovary. The ovary is the female gonad. It develops from the same tissue that the testes do in males. The ovary is, not directly connected, but is located, it's actually connected to the uterus by this little piece of connective tissue right here, and very peripherally close to the ovary is the fallopian or uterine tube. Each ovary has a uterine tube that is connected to it. At the end of the uterine tube is a structure that's sometimes called the horn, where it, kind of expands out like the bell of a horn or a trumpet and puts out these little fingers. Those fingers have ciliated fimbriae on them, and the ciliated fimbriae create a current that basically pulls liquid into the tube, so that when the egg is released from the ovary, it will hopefully get sucked into the uterine tube and then down to the uterus. This structure here is the uterus. In common parlance, it's called the womb, but technically it's the uterus. This is where a developing embryo and fetus sits, lives, and is supported. The uterus is suspended within the abdominal cavity by the round ligament that basically keeps it into place. The uterus we will be examining in more detail, but it has several layers of tissue. And at the inferior end, or at least the end that is adjacent to the vagina, we have the cervix of the uterus right here, which is basically the opening of the uterus. The uterus opens into the vaginal cavity right here. Let's see, what else is important? Yes, in terms of external genitalia, the opening to the vagina is surrounded by the labia minorum, or the labium minus. Labia minorum is probably the more common term for it, which is in turn surrounded by the labium majus or labia majorum, which are the inner and outer linings of the vaginal opening that cover sort of the entire genital area. They cover the vaginal opening, the urethral opening that leads to the urinary bladder, as well as the clitoris. The clitoris is formed from the same tissue that forms the glands or head of the penis in males. And like the head of the penis in males, it is a very sensitive area for sexual excitement. This is probably, hopefully, not news for anyone here. The clitoris is surrounded and protected by the prepuce, which is a hood of tissue formed from the top of the labia majorum that basically wraps around and protects it from overstimulation. The uterus and ovaries are pictured here. It's probably the most complicated set of organs in the female reproductive system. The uterus is about the shape of a pear-ish. It has a small end on the bottom. Here we see the cervix. The cervix actually extends into the vaginal cavity and has a small cervical canal here. The body of the uterus is the middle part, and the fundus is its top surface. The uterus is connected almost connected to the ovaries by the uterine or fallopian tubes, which have several parts. This narrow part that is closest to the uterus is called the isthmus. This part here, where it turns and starts to widen out, is called the ampulla. This part at the end is called the infundibulum. It is sometimes called the horn as well, though infundibulum is the proper term. And these finger-like projections at the end, which are ciliated, are called the fimbriae. Most of the uterus has 3 layers to it. The perimetrium on the outside is a layer of epithelial and connective tissue. The myometrium, which forms most of the mass of the uterus under normal circumstances, is a heavily vascularized smooth muscle. And the endometrium, which we will be talking about more extensively, is epithelial tissue plus some other stuff, and it actually changes in its composition and its thickness over the course of the female sexual cycle. The uterine tube and the ovary are held into place by this sheet of connective tissue called the broad ligament. And the ovary is specifically anchored to the uterus by the ovarian ligament here. Both the ovary and the uterus are very highly vascularized tissue. So you can see lots and lots of blood vessels going into them. The top part of the uterine tube here, basically the outer edge of the infundibulum, is supplied with blood through the ovarian artery and is held in place by the suspensory ligament, which basically keeps it from falling down and collapsing next to the uterus. So let's talk about the structure of the ovary and the process of oogenesis and what's called follicle development. Now, this is going to be a bit different than it is in males. In males, you're born with the basically spermatic stem cells, and they keep dividing and pumping out sperm starting at puberty and going until relatively old age. With hormone therapy, males can continue producing effective sperm up until their 70s. They're still producing some, probably up until the day they die. Females, on the other hand, are born with all of the eggs that they will ever have already started. They are started in as what are called primordial follicles, which is a pre-egg cell surrounded by some support structures. Now, men, when they use their sperm, might shoot out, tens of thousands, hundreds, it's like 50 to 90,000 sperm at a go. So we need to make a lot of sperm. Women typically only make 1 egg at a time. There are several reasons for this. An egg contains all of the nutrients that will nurture a developing embryo through its first several weeks of life. So it represents a much more significant investiture of energy, but also for various developmental reasons as well. So the ovary has a outside layer of connective and epithelial tissue called the tunica albuginea, and inside it has a cortex, which is the outer portion, and a medulla. The medulla primarily contains vascular tissue that are going to be highly vascularized, have lots of nutrients and blood and everything like that that comes into it. The cortex is where most of the action actually takes place. And it's where most of these primordial follicles are located. In the monthly cycle, we'll talk about specifically the timing of this in just a second. Primordial follicle is activated and begins developing into what's called a primary follicle. The primary follicle develops into a secondary follicle. A secondary follicle develops into a tertiary follicle, which further develops into a mature or Graafian follicle. And note here that the egg is not necessarily increasing in size. It is actually undergoing the last steps of meiosis, as we'll see. But what's developing is the support structure around it. Every month, several eggs will develop into follicles. However, typically, only one will be selected to go on to ovulation. And during ovulation, the mature follicle will push itself against the uterine wall. Sorry, not uterine wall, ovarian wall, until eventually it pops. When it pops, the pressure of fluid inside of here sort of squirt the ovulated egg cell or oocyte out, basically pop, and it squirts out. But all of these support cells of the follicle remain in the ovary and sort of begin to take on a different role. They shrivel up and begin secreting a hormone called and secrete basically progesterone and estrogen, but they develop into what's called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is this shriveled up leftover bit of the follicle. It is maintained by luteinizing hormone, and it makes the hormones that are necessary to maintain a pregnancy until the placenta itself can take over the job. So this is going to secrete all of the hormones responsible for maintaining a pregnancy until either it becomes apparent that you're not pregnant, and if that happens, it turns into a corpus albicanus, which is basically a little mass of scar tissue. Or if pregnancy does happen, then the corpus luteum will continue to pump out progesterone and other hormones to maintain the pregnancy until, basically through the first trimester-ish. Let's look at the actual events of oogenesis and follicular development. So, the first thing to keep in mind is that there are two things you need to keep your eye on here. With males, you basically just had to look at the development of the sperm. With females, you have the development of the egg cells, or the oocytes, as well as the development of the support cells around them, called the follicle. And both of these are important, and there's different events happening in both. Now, during the development of a female infant, like I said, you're born with all of the eggs that you will ever have. During the development of the female infant in the developing ovaries, there are cells called oogonia. These are diploid cells that replicate over and over and over again, undergoing lots and lots of mitosis, so that you have a large number of these cells. Before birth, these oogonia develop into what are called primary oocytes. These are primordial eggs, and they are still diploid. They have not yet undergone meiosis. Before birth, you start off with some follicular cells that begin to surround the oocyte as well. These follicular cells are support cells, and at this stage, the entire structure is called a primordial follicle. All right? And that's the primary oocyte surrounded by some follicular cells. Most of these primary oocytes will actually degrade by the time the girl is born, and up until puberty, they're basically going away. They're sort of dying. You start off with, millions of them, but by the time puberty hits, you've typically got about 200,000 primary oocytes at puberty. Now that wouldn't be very many for a male, because we're shooting off, 50,000, 100,000 at a go. But for a female, she's probably only going to ovulate maybe 480 times over the course of her entire life. When you figure that, she's going to be pregnant some of that time, some of those events are going to be double ovulations. That's how you get fraternal twins. This is pretty much a lifetime supply. Like, you don't need 200,000 eggs. You're not going to have 200,000 menstrual cycles. So even though you start off with a limited number of them, and you can't get more, it's usually plenty. And in fact, you are going to start using them up at a faster rate than we will expect, and we'll see later on. But what it does mean is that since those cells are there in waiting, the longer past puberty that a woman waits to have children, the more chance there is for genetic damage to accumulate. This is why things like Down syndrome and several other genetic disorders, the odds of them go up for older mothers, whereas the age of the father seldom has much of a role in that, because the male is making new sperm all the time, whereas the eggs do age. They've been around since birth. From adolescence to menopause, basically these things are just waiting. But during menopause, the ovarian cycle begins. And the ovarian cycle, every month, women go through what's called the sexual cycle, which consists of the ovarian cycle, which is the events that happen in the ovaries, and the menstrual cycle, which is the events that happen in the uterus. Both of these are basically happening at the same time, But they're controlled by somewhat different hormones, and they are happening in different places. So at the start of each monthly cycle, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, will begin to stimulate a cohort of oocytes to complete meiosis 1. So that is happening right here, and FSH is stimulating that. A cohort is, so actually for every one final egg that is produced, you start off with about 24 potential eggs. One of them is eventually going to be selected to be the one that's ovulated, but you start off with 24 of them, just in case some of them have detectable damage or something goes wrong. This is a delicate process. If anything screws up, you've got a lot of backup copies. So FSH stimulates the primary oocyte to develop into a secondary oocyte by undergoing meiosis 1. Remember, meiosis 1 is going to be that first set of steps that will result in chromosome reduction. So after this point, the egg will be haploid, and this secondary oocyte is haploid. With sperm, what we saw was when they underwent meiosis 1, they divided into 2 secondary spermatids. With ovaries and oogenesis, what we see is they're going to turn into 1 secondary oocyte and 1 what's called polar body. A polar body contains the nuclear material, the genes that split off, but basically instead of splitting down the middle, it splits at the edge, so that one of the products, the secondary oocyte, gets all of the cytoplasm, all of the organelles, all of the nutrients. There's a good reason for this. Eggs are expensive to build. They are chock full of everything that you need to make an embryo for the first several weeks. That means that they've got like a lot of nutrients and stuff in them. You're only going to end up making 1 egg. So whatever it is that's made here from meiosis, that thing's destiny is to die. And if it contained half of the egg's material, all of that material would be wasted. So since this thing's just going to die anyways, it doesn't get much of anything that it needs. And all of the material is conserved with the oocyte. Alright? The secondary oocyte will develop into is what's ovulated. Alright? And if it is not fertilized, the secondary oocyte dies. It does not undergo the rest of meiosis. The secondary oocyte, if it is fertilized, then it actually undergoes the second half of meiosis, meiosis 2, and ejects a second polar body. Once that polar body has been ejected, then, even though it's already been fertilized, like the sperm's in there, but once the sperm is basically held in stasis until meiosis 2 is completed, and then the genetic material is unified, and this becomes a zygote that will start developing into a new person. Looking at the follicle, after the completion of meiosis 1, so this is at the start of the cycle, the follicular cells begin to divide. And it changes from a primordial follicle to what's called a primary follicle. This is a follicle. It's surrounded by granulosa cells, and they begin to proliferate. This process of going from a primordial follicle to a primary follicle takes about 140 days. So even though new eggs are started at the beginning of every monthly cycle, those ones that are started at the beginning of the monthly cycle aren't the eggs that are going to be ovulated at the end of that monthly cycle. It's kind of like a high school, right? So you take a look at any high school, you're going to see there are always freshmen coming in, there are always sophomores, there are always seniors and juniors and seniors, and at the end of every year, seniors graduate. At the beginning of every year, new freshmen come in. But the seniors that graduate at the end of the year aren't the ones that came in as the freshmen, right? So this whole process of going from your primordial follicle to ovulation is going to take a lot of days. This process of the primordial follicle changing into the primary follicle, as this happens, these begin developing receptors for FSH. So this second step is actually going to be dependent on FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, to happen. And the primary follicle turning into a secondary follicle is going to take about 30 days. Which means that the secondary follicle is formed about on day 170 of the cycle. This follicle is now enclosed in 3 layers of cells, right? The granulosa cells are the ones that have the receptors for FSH, and they are the deepest layer of cells. It's surrounded in a tough husk on the outside called the theca folliculi, and this is has lots of blood vessels in it that are going to supply lots of nutrients and oxygen. And underneath the granulosa cells, there's an acellular, a non-cellular jelly layer called the zona pellucida. And this is a glycoprotein gel. It's basically, well, if you've ever seen egg whites, it's kind of similar to that. About 60 days before ovulation, so about 2 menstrual cycles before ovulation, the secondary follicle will become a tertiary follicle. And the tertiary follicle can be distinguished by the presence of basically the zona pellucida has swelled up to become this large internal fluid-filled area called the antrum. and the granulosa cells surrounding the oocyte are called the cumulus oophorus. And so these are granulosa cells that continue to surround the ovum. You also have granulosa cells that form the outside of this follicle, and those form a structure called the theca interna. And the theca externa is basically similar to the theca folliculi. It's still a hard outer shell. At this stage, one of the cohort, remember we started off with like 24 different eggs that are developing here. Some of them will have fallen by the wayside because of problems with them, but we'll usually have several of them left by this point. One of them, as far as we know at random, will be selected to become a Graafian or mature follicle. The mature follicle basically pushes itself against the ovary wall, and it captures lots of FSH. It basically captures and sequesters FSH inside of it, keeping that FSH inside. Nobody knows exactly how that happens, but only the follicle that will become the mature Graafian follicle begins to accumulate FSH. All of the ones that were rejected, that aren't going to be selected, they don't accumulate FSH. This happens about 20 days before ovulation, which is late in the previous menstrual cycle. And the pressure in here begins to build up and up and up and get higher and higher and higher. And we'll talk about the hormonal reasons why that happens. And that causes it to push harder and harder and harder against the ovarian wall until eventually it basically pops through the wall, and the ovum and a few follicular cells surrounding it are ovulated. And after that, for the next 15 days-ish, assuming that no pregnancy occurs, these cells become the corpus luteum, which means the yellow body. All right, now let's talk about the hormones that are going on and controlling this entire thing. The ovarian cycle is dominated by basically two hormones, FSH and LH. All right? The start of the sexual cycle officially begins on the first day of menstruation. So this day here, day 1, that's the first day of menstruation. In day 1, this is the follicular phase. So this first half is the follicular phase, and in its effects tends to be dominated by FSH, although LH is also going to be very important. High levels of FSH dominate the early part of this phase, and that's what will stimulate the development of those follicles and growth of those follicles, and will begin recruiting those new primordial follicles to turn into primary follicles. as this goes on, we'll see what's happening with estrogen and progesterone in a second. But as this goes on, estradiol continues to increase, and estradiol inhibits the secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone by the hypothalamus through negative feedback. This means that the anterior pituitary secretes less and less and less FSH as you continue through this follicular phase, but it secretes increasing amounts of LH. This process of FSH dying off seems to be important in selecting which follicle will become mature, right? The lowering levels of FSH mean that most of the follicles will just simply stop developing and atrophy, but the one that's been basically banking this FSH by accumulating it inside of itself has the most FSH receptors, and it will continue to be able to develop even in these low levels of FSH. Towards the end of the follicular phase, estradiol causes a surge in LH and a lesser surge in FSH as well. This surge in LH spiking, is what causes ovulation to occur. It also does a few other things as well. It is going to stimulate primary oocytes to undergo meiosis 1 and to eject their first polar body. So it's going to actually be regulating several different stages of this cycle. But the LH surge is most well known for controlling the timing of ovulation. The second half of the cycle is called the luteal phase and is dominated by actions of LH. At this point, the egg, the oocyte, is no longer in the ovary, so what's happening in the ovary is no longer affecting it. Well, sort of. At least, what's happening in the ovary isn't affecting it directly. However, remember this follicle here is going to become the corpus luteum. The influence of luteinizing hormone is what causes these follicles to become the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to secrete hormones, particularly progesterone, that are going to be very important in the menstrual cycle. Over the course of the second half of the ovarian cycle, the corpus luteum will degenerate, undergoing a process called involution, where it basically shrinks and starts to secrete less and less and less hormones, eventually ending up this corpus albicans, or white body, which is basically just a little bit of scar tissue. This is what happens if pregnancy doesn't occur. If pregnancy does occur, then the corpus luteum will continue to thrive and will not undergo involution, at least not quickly. Let's take a look at a global view of the control of ovulation, and exactly what feedback loops are going on here. So a maturing follicle will secrete estrogen in somewhat the same way that the testes secrete testosterone. Estradiol specifically. I shouldn't say estrogen. Estrogen is a more general term. So this is secreting estradiol. Estradiol stimulates the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. It stimulates the hypothalamus to produce gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And so estradiol and gonadotropin-releasing hormones stimulate the anterior pituitary to release LH and FSH. This basically results in a positive feedback loop, right? And the more LH and FSH you have, FSH is going to stimulate the follicle to keep developing, which causes the follicle to release more estradiol, which causes more FSH, which causes more follicular development, and also more LH as well. And eventually this positive feedback loop, remember positive feedback loops build on themselves over and over and over. That's what causes the LH surge. Once that LH positive feedback loop builds up high enough, then ovulation occurs. And once ovulation occurs, things change, and this feedback loop is no longer maintained. So, while there are events happening in the ovary, there are also events happening in the uterus. The events happening in the uterus are called the menstrual cycle. Again, day 1 of the menstrual cycle is the first day of menstruation. The menstrual cycle has 4 phases: the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, the secretory phase, and the premenstrual phase. And it is primarily controlled by the hormones estradiol and progesterone. During the menstrual phase, the lining of the endometrium is sloughing off. It is no longer being maintained by progesterone from the corpus luteus, and so it begins to die and degrade, and this is what causes menstrual bleeding. So during the first part of the cycle, the menstrual phase, what you have is the endometrium sloughing off, dying away, and being ejected from the body. You can see that the hormone levels at this stage, you have low progesterone and fairly low estradiol as well. During the secretory phase, during the proliferative phase, the layers of endometrial tissue are going to start building back up again. Slowly at first, but at an increasing speed. This happens kind of automatically at the beginning, but as estradiol levels increase, because remember the developing follicle is being stimulated to produce estradiol, which causes more FSH and more LH, which causes more estradiol, which causes more FSH and more LH, and you have all of those events going on in the ovary. Well, that increasing amount of estradiol is going to cause the endometrial lining to proliferate, basically to get thicker. By the time ovulation occurs, usually around day 15, the endometrial layer will be 2 to 3 millimeters thick, and it has begun to prepare itself to accept a developing embryo. The thickening during the proliferative phase is caused by cells undergoing mitosis. These are, a bunch of different types of cells, but a lot of them are basically epithelial cells. And the reason why this is getting thicker and thicker and thicker is that the cells are dividing. The lining continues to get thicker in the third phase, the secretory phase, but in this phase it's not getting thicker because it is the cells are dividing, but rather because it's basically filling up with fluid, like a sponge expanding when you get it wet. And the fluid that it's filling up with is filling these channels right here, making the lining of the uterus basically spongy and sticky and soft, and it's filling up with, among other things, glycogen. Remember that glycogen is a polymer of glucose. Until the placenta develops, the developing embryo can't get nutrients from the mother's blood. So instead, or at least it can't get it directly from the mother's blood. The placenta is the organ that handles that transfer. Instead, it has to basically be constantly bathed in a nutrient and oxygen-rich solution. So if pregnancy occurs, this glycogen that fills up the endometrial tissue is what's going to provide nutrition support for the developing embryo until the placenta comes online. This phase is dominated by the hormone progesterone, which is primarily secreted by the corpus luteum. So after ovulation, the corpus luteum begins secreting progesterone, and so you can see that progesterone levels are low, 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 low until ovulation, and then suddenly progesterone levels are high, 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 high. So the secretory phase is dominated by the hormone progesterone. Estrogen is still up there, right? It's not, it hasn't gone away, but progesterone is the dominant hormone in this case, and it's what's going to cause the accumulation of glycogen and the proliferation of arteries and veins and vascular tissue into the endometrial layer. Right. As the corpus luteum degenerates, assuming the pregnancy doesn't occur, it produces less progesterone. Progesterone was basically what was keeping this endometrial layer thick and healthy. And when progesterone falls off, and since the egg didn't develop into a fetus, it's no longer secreting estradiol either. Estrogen also starts to fall off. All of this expanded tissue no longer has the hormones that are necessary to support it, and it begins to start shriveling up and dying off. This is what's called the premenstrual phase. The drop in progesterone triggers spasmodic contractions in the myometrium, basically in the uterus, as well as in lots of other muscles surrounding that area. The blood vessels that supply blood to this area undergo contraction, meaning that you have less blood flowing into the area, and that causes the tissue to start dying away. As the tissue begins to die away, you enter into the next menstrual phase, as the tissue dies away and sloughs off. Here you can see the development of the tissue of the endometrium at the various stages of the menstrual cycle. Basically, after the menstrual phase, this tissue degrades down to the basal layer. And during the proliferative phase, cells reproduce and divide and divide and divide, rebuilding the endometrium. The endometrium is epithelial tissue, some connective tissue, and lots of blood vessels called spiral arteries. And the reason why you make these arteries as spirals will become apparent in just a second. There's also glandular tissue in here. During the secretory phase, that glandular tissue is going to secrete the glycogen, as well as a few other things, into the endometrial tissue. This causes the endometrial tissue to expand and grow. This isn't because it's adding new cells, but it's just basically stretching out. Now you see why these spiral arteries grow in sort of a spiral form. It's so that, like a spring, when this tissue grows, those arteries can stretch out without breaking. During the premenstrual and menstrual phase, these arteries down here are going to contract, restricting blood flow to this area. And especially up here, the farthest places away, where the artery's been stretched out, now become oxygen starved, and the tissue here begins to necrotize due to lack of oxygen and die away. And it will eventually die away all the way back down to the basal layer and start to build itself back up in the proliferative phase. This is what the female sexual cycle looks like if pregnancy does not occur. If pregnancy does occur, then the developing embryo will produce a hormone that tells the corpus luteum not to degrade. And the corpus luteum will continue to stick around, producing progesterone primarily, and that progesterone will continue to maintain the endometrium in its secretory form so that it stays healthy and spongy and continues to have lots of arteries giving lots of blood and oxygen to it and makes lots of glycogen to nourish the developing embryo. This is the basics of how birth control works. There are several forms of oral birth control. There's a progesterone and estrogen form, as well as a progesterone-only form. The estrogen can help, but the progesterone is what's absolutely important. Keeping progesterone around means that at high levels throughout the course of the cycle, basically convinces your body that it's pregnant. And when your body's pregnant, it stops developing new oocytes, right? If you're already full up, you can't take on any more passengers. If you're already pregnant, there's no point in undergoing ovulation or anything like that. So progesterone actually provides negative feedback to the anterior pituitary that will prevent the secretion of LH and FSH. When you're pregnant, that progesterone is supplied by the corpus luteum, which continues to stick around for a few months until eventually it atrophies because it can't live forever. But by that point, usually the developing embryo has a developed placenta, and the placenta will begin secreting its own progesterone. So that's how birth control typically works. I'll get into how this process can go wrong, and a little bit about how gestation and development works, at least from the maternal perspective, in CLEX.